the twin sons of a Hells Angels member were blind until the new maid changed everything at Christmas. In the shadowy, often unforgiving world of motorcycle clubs, where loyalty was etched deeper than any tattoo and a man's reputation preceded him like a thunderclap, Frank Moretti stood as a formidable figure. A high-ranking member of the Hells Angels, Frank commanded respect, or at the very least, a healthy dose of fear, from those who knew his name. His life was a tapestry woven with the roar of engines, the clinking of glasses in dimly lit bars, and the unspoken codes of brotherhood. Yet, beneath the hardened exterior, the leather jacket, and the steely gaze, Frank harbored a profound, almost crippling vulnerability, a secret heartache locked away behind the reinforced doors of his sprawling, somewhat neglected home on the outskirts of the city. This vulnerability manifested in the form of his two sons, Leo and Max, identical twin boys of 8 years, whose world existed in perpetual darkness. They were blind, born with a rare congenital condition that had robbed them of sight, leaving them to navigate their existence through touch, sound, and an acute, almost otherworldly, sense of their surroundings. Their home, once a vibrant space, had slowly transformed into a quiet, almost sterile environment, designed more for safety than for joy. Sharp edges were padded, furniture remained rigidly in place, and the sounds of the outside world were often muffled, creating a cocoon that, while protective, was also isolating. Frank, a man accustomed to confronting danger head-on, found himself utterly powerless in the face of his son's blindness. He loved them fiercely, a love that was a raw, visceral ache in his chest, but he didn't know how to connect with them, how to bring light into their sightless world. His attempts often felt clumsy, his rough hands too big, his voice too gruff. He'd buy them expensive toys, the kind that lit up or made noise, but the initial excitement would quickly fade, replaced by the familiar quietude that seemed to cling to the boys like a second skin. He found solace, or perhaps just distraction, in the familiar chaos of his club life, leaving the boys largely to their own devices, or under the care of a rotating cast of housekeepers who rarely lasted longer than a few months. The house itself reflected this lack of consistent care. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that penetrated the drawn blinds, the scent of stale coffee mingled with the faint aroma of cleaning products, and the general atmosphere was one of quiet resignation. Leo and Max, indistinguishable to the casual observer with their fair hair and delicate features, had developed their own intricate world. They moved through the house with an uncanny grace, their bare feet mapping every floorboard, every rug, every obstacle. They communicated in hushed tones, often finishing each other's sentences, their bond forged not just by brotherhood but by their shared experience of darkness. They spent hours in their room, listening to audiobooks, playing with textured toys, or simply sitting in silence, their minds painting pictures that no one else could see. Frank would sometimes stand outside their closed door, listening to their soft murmurs, a heavy weight settling in his stomach. He wanted more for them, desperately, but he simply didn't know how to give it. As the autumn leaves began to fall, painting the world in hues of crimson and gold that the boys would never witness, Frank found himself once again in need of domestic help. The latest housekeeper had departed abruptly after a particularly loud gathering at the clubhouse that had spilled over into the early hours of the morning. Frank didn't blame her, his life was not for the faint of heart. He posted an advertisement, terse and to the point, hoping to find someone who could manage the house and, perhaps, offer some semblance of stability for his sons. He wasn't looking for a miracle worker, he was looking for someone reliable, someone who wouldn't flinch at his lifestyle or the unique challenges of his household. The woman who responded to his ad was named Maria. She was small, with kind eyes that held a surprising depth, and hair the color of rich earth, pulled back neatly from her face. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a gentle cadence, and her demeanor was one of quiet strength. Frank, accustomed to judging people quickly, found himself disarmed by her calm presence. She didn't seem intimidated by his imposing stature or the subtle hints of his affiliation that permeated his home. When he explained the situation with the boys, her expression softened further, a genuine empathy shining in her eyes that made Frank feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope, perhaps, or at least a brief respite from the ever-present weight of his burden. Maria started work the following week. Her arrival was almost imperceptible, a quiet shift in the house's languid rhythm. She moved through the rooms with a purpose, her steps light, her hands efficient. She cleaned not just the surfaces but seemed to breathe new life into the neglected corners, opening curtains slightly to let in more natural light, even if the boys couldn't see it. The scent of fresh flowers, though artificial, replaced the mustiness, and the faint aroma of cinnamon began to waft from the kitchen. Frank watched her from a distance, a silent observer of this small woman who seemed to possess an almost magical ability to bring order to his chaotic world. The boys, initially wary of the new presence, slowly began to respond to Maria. She didn't treat them with pity, nor did she speak to them in the overly solicitous tone that many adults adopted. Instead, she spoke to them directly, gently, her voice a soothing balm in their quiet world. She would describe the colors of the clothes she was folding, the textures of the fruits she was preparing, the sounds of the birds outside the window. She brought them small, unexpected gifts, a smooth, cool stone she found in the garden, a soft, fluffy feather, a piece of fabric with an interesting weave. These simple gestures, so different from Frank's grand, often impersonal offerings, began to chip away at the boy's protective shell. One afternoon, Maria found Leo tracing the patterns on an old, worn rug in the living room, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately. She knelt beside him, her presence a soft warmth. "That's a beautiful pattern, isn't it, Leo?" she murmured. "It reminds me of the swirls in a cup of coffee when you stir in cream." Leo paused, his head tilting slightly, imagining the description. Max, who had been listening from his spot on the sofa, shifted, a faint smile playing on his lips. It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but for Maria, it was a profound interaction, a quiet bridge being built. Frank noticed these subtle changes. The house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. The boys, while still quiet, seemed less withdrawn. He'd catch glimpses of them interacting with Maria, their small hands reaching out to touch her apron, their voices softer, more engaged. He didn't understand how she did it, this woman who seemed to glide through his life, leaving a trail of quiet warmth in her wake. He was a man of action, of force, but Maria's power lay in her gentle patience, her keen observation, and an innate understanding that went beyond words. As November drew to a close, the first whispers of Christmas began to permeate the air outside. Department stores hung glittering decorations, festive music started playing on the radio, and the scent of pine and gingerbread began to waft from bakeries. In Frank's house, however, Christmas had always been a subdued affair, a stark reminder of what the boys couldn't experience. Frank usually bought them a few expensive gifts, wrapped them himself in clumsy fashion, and then retreated, leaving the unwrapping to be a quiet, almost melancholic ritual. He saw no point in the elaborate decorations, the twinkling lights, or the festive meals when the main beneficiaries couldn't truly appreciate them. Maria, however, saw things differently. She saw the potential for joy, for sensory experiences that transcended sight. One evening, as Frank was about to leave for a club meeting, he found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded dough. The aroma of spices filled the air. "It's almost December," she said, without looking up, "and I thought it would be nice to make some gingerbread cookies. The boys might enjoy the smell, and perhaps decorating them by touch." Frank grunted, a noncommittal sound, but he didn't forbid it. He left for his meeting, the scent of gingerbread clinging to his clothes, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. The next few weeks saw Maria subtly transforming the house. She brought in small, scented candles, their fragrances of pine and orange blossom filling the rooms. She found a small, artificial Christmas tree that had been stored in the attic, forgotten for years, and carefully set it up in the living room. Instead of traditional ornaments, she hung soft, plush decorations, bells that jingled softly, and pine cones that released a subtle, earthy scent. She encouraged the boys to touch everything, to explore the new textures and sounds. Leo and Max, initially hesitant, soon found themselves drawn to the tree, their fingers tentatively exploring the soft needles, the smooth curves of the bells, the rough bark of the pine cones. They would sit by the tree for long stretches, their faces rapt, listening to the gentle jingle of the ornaments, their imaginations painting a festive scene only they could truly perceive. Maria also began to tell them stories, not just from books, but stories from her own childhood, tales of snow angels, of warm fires, of the unique smells and sounds of Christmas. She described the feeling of soft snow falling on her face, the warmth of a mug of hot chocolate, the joy of singing carols. Her voice was a gentle current, carrying them to places they had never been, creating vivid landscapes in their minds. Frank would sometimes find himself lingering in the hallway, listening, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him. He saw a light in his son's eyes that he hadn't seen before, a spark of genuine curiosity and delight. He was witnessing a quiet revolution, a subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere of his home, all orchestrated by this unassuming woman. The approach of Christmas Day brought with it a palpable sense of anticipation, something that had been absent from this house for years. Maria had enlisted the boys' help in making small gifts for each other and for Frank, guiding their hands as they crafted simple, tactile presents, a braided friendship bracelet, a small clay sculpture, a hand-stitched sachet filled with dried lavender. Frank watched them, his heart heavy with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, but something akin to awe, a recognition of the beauty that Maria was weaving into their lives. He saw how she had connected with them, not through grand gestures or expensive toys, but through understanding, patience, and a willingness to meet them in their own world. He saw how she had begun to change everything. The scent of cinnamon and pine needles, once alien to the stale air of Frank Moretti's home, now mingled with the faint, sweet aroma of gingerbread baking. Maria moved through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, her humming a soft counterpoint to the gentle clinking of ceramic bowls. Leo and Max, perched on stools at the kitchen island, their small hands dusted with flour, were deeply engrossed in their task. Maria had given them small, textured cookie cutters, a star, a bell, a little boot, and they meticulously pressed them into the soft dough, their fingers exploring the shapes before carefully lifting the cutouts. Frank, usually long gone by this hour, found himself lingering. He sat at the polished mahogany table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, ostensibly reading the newspaper. But his eyes, hidden behind the broadsheets, were fixed on his son's. He watched how Maria guided their hands, how she described the warmth of the dough, the sharp edges of the cutters, the sweet promise of the spices. He heard Leo giggle, a sound that rarely escaped his lips, as he pressed a star shape, imagining its points. Max, ever the quieter twin, hummed along with Maria, his concentration absolute. Frank felt a strange softening in his chest, a sensation he hadn't known since before their mother left, a feeling both comforting and unsettling. Maria's influence wasn't confined to the kitchen. The living room, once a mausoleum of silence, now held a small, artificial Christmas tree, its soft, fabric ornaments and jingling bells offering a symphony of touch and sound. She had found old, forgotten Christmas records in the attic, and now the mellow tones of Bing Crosby or Nat King Cole drifted through the house, a gentle, unfamiliar backdrop to their days. The boys would spend hours by the tree, their fingers exploring the plush reindeer, the smooth glass of the bells, the rough bark of the pine cones Maria had arranged at its base. They would describe to each other what they felt, creating a shared, tactile landscape of Christmas. Frank would sometimes find himself standing in the doorway, listening to their hushed conversations, a silent observer to this quiet miracle. He was a man of action, of loud engines and sharp words, yet this gentle transformation, wrought by a woman of quiet strength, left him utterly speechless. One afternoon, as Frank was about to head out for a meeting at the clubhouse, Leo tugged at his leather jacket. "Dad," he said, his voice soft, "Maria says the snow feels like soft feathers. Is it true?" Frank paused, his hand on the doorknob. He hadn't thought about snow in years, not in that way. Yeah, son," he mumbled, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Sometimes it does. Like tiny, cold feathers." Max then added, "And Maria says hot chocolate warms you from the inside out. Does it feel like a warm hug?" Frank looked at his boys, their blind eyes turned towards him, full of innocent curiosity. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, Max. A warm hug." He felt a pang, a sudden, sharp ache of regret for all the years he hadn't known how to give them those feelings, those descriptions. He left for his meeting with a heavy heart, the image of his son's expectant faces burned into his mind, the question of a warm hug echoing in his ears. The changes in Frank's home, however subtle, did not go unnoticed by the outside world, particularly not by the keen eyes of his club brothers. Grinder, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a permanent scowl, was the first to openly comment. He'd shown up unannounced one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss club business, but his gaze swept over the faintly festive living room, lingering on the small tree. "What's with the holiday cheer, Frank?" Grinder rumbled, a hint of suspicion in his voice. Goin' soft on us? Frank felt a surge of defensiveness, a familiar anger rising. He was Frank Moretti, a Hell's Angel, not some domesticated suburban dad. Yet, when he glanced towards the kitchen and saw Maria calmly wiping down the counters, a soft smile on her face, the anger dissipated, replaced by a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness. It's for the boys, Grinder, Frank said, his voice low, a warning note in it. They deserve a Christmas like anyone else. Grinder grunted, unconvinced, but Maria, hearing the exchange, stepped into the living room. Would you like a gingerbread cookie, Mr. Grinder? She asked, her voice calm, her eyes kind. Grinder, caught off guard by her polite demeanor, looked from the small woman to Frank, then back to the cookie she offered. He took one, his large fingers gingerly picking up the star-shaped biscuit. He bit into it, his expression softening imperceptibly. Ain't bad, he mumbled, and then, after another bite, actually, it's pretty good. Maria simply smiled, a quiet victory in her eyes. Frank watched the interaction, a strange pride swelling in his chest. Maria, with her gentle kindness, had disarmed a man twice her size, a man who intimidated most. It was a power Frank understood in theory, but had never witnessed so effectively in practice. As Christmas Eve approached, the house was filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. Maria had orchestrated a quiet, sensory-rich evening. The smell of pine and orange blossom from the scented candles mingled with the aroma of a special dinner she had prepared. Soft Christmas carols played from a small, old radio. The boys, dressed in new, soft pajamas, sat by the tree, their faces alight with an excitement Frank hadn't seen in years. Maria had helped them craft small, tactile gifts for Frank and for each other, a braided bracelet for Leo, a small, smooth clay sculpture for Max, a hand-stitched sachet filled with dried lavender for Frank. Frank, Maria said softly, her voice breaking through his thoughts, would you like to read them a story? She held out a large, textured children's book, its pages designed for touch. Frank hesitated. He hadn't read to his sons since they were toddlers, before the full extent of their blindness became apparent. His hands felt clumsy, his voice too rough for such gentle tales. But he saw the expectant faces of his sons, felt Maria's gentle gaze, and something shifted within him. He took the book. His fingers, calloused from years of gripping handlebars and wrenching tools, slowly traced the raised letters, fumbling slightly. He began to read, his voice initially hesitant, then gaining a surprising warmth as he described the textures on the page, the softness of a lamb's wool, the rough bark of a stable door. Leo and Max leaned into him, their small bodies warm against his side, their minds painting vivid pictures from his words. It was a moment of profound, almost overwhelming connection, a warmth spreading through Frank that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth. He felt their small hands reach out, not to his gifts, but to his arm, a silent gesture of comfort and connection. A tear, unbidden, pricked at the corner of Frank's eye, a sensation he quickly blinked away. On Christmas Day morning, the boys awoke with a joyful energy that vibrated through the quiet house. Maria had prepared a simple breakfast of warm oatmeal and fresh fruit, the scent of cinnamon again filling the air. Then came the unwrapping of gifts. Frank, guided by Maria, had wrapped his presents with surprising care this year. He watched as Leo and Max, their fingers nimble and precise, explored the textures of the wrapping paper, carefully tearing it away. Frank had bought them a set of wooden building blocks with different textures and shapes, and a high-quality audio recorder for them to tell their own stories. Their cries of delight, as they felt the smooth wood and heard the crisp sound of their own voices, were music to Frank's ears. He saw their faces, not just with his eyes, but with a deeper understanding, sensing their joy radiating from them like a tangible light. Maria then presented Frank with a small, wrapped package. Inside, he found a simple, hand-knitted scarf, soft and warm, in a deep forest green. Tucked inside was a small, crudely drawn picture, clearly made by Leo and Max, of three stick figures holding hands, with a sun in the corner. Frank's rough fingers traced the soft yarn, then the raised lines of the drawing. He looked at Maria, then at his sons. "Thank you," he managed, the words thick in his throat. It was the most meaningful gift he had ever received, a symbol of the warmth, the connection, the family that Maria had woven into his fractured life. As the day wore on, filled with shared stories, the gentle jingle of ornaments, and the comforting aroma of Christmas dinner, Frank felt a profound sense of peace he hadn't known possible. This was what he had longed for, what he hadn't known how to create. Maria had not just brought light into his son's sightless world, she had brought light into his own. The phone rang just as Maria was clearing the dinner plates, its harsh jangle cutting through the festive atmosphere. Frank answered, his face instantly hardening as he listened. It was Grinder. "Frank, we got a situation. Need you down at the clubhouse. Now." The urgency in Grinder's voice was unmistakable. Frank's two worlds, so delicately balanced by Maria's gentle hand, suddenly collided. He looked from the phone to his sons, who had sensed the shift in his demeanor, their small faces turning towards him, their joy slowly fading. He looked at Maria, her kind eyes filled with understanding, and a silent question. Frank was at a crossroads, the warmth of his newfound domestic peace clashing with the relentless demands of his club life. The quiet revolution in his home had begun, but the true test of its lasting power was only just beginning. Frank stood frozen, the phone a cold weight in his hand, the festive sounds of Christmas dinner suddenly muted, replaced by the ominous echo of Grinder's demand. His sons, incredibly perceptive, had already sensed the shift, their small, sightless faces turning towards him, their earlier joy fading like a snuffed candle. Maria, her hands still holding a stack of dinner plates, watched him, her kind eyes full of an unspoken question, a deep understanding of the two worlds that now threatened to tear him apart. He looked at Leo and Max, their innocent faces reflecting the sudden tension in the air. Their world, which Maria had so carefully filled with light and sensory wonder, was suddenly vulnerable to the harsh realities of his other life. The warmth in his chest, so recently kindled, began to chill. He saw their small, hopeful gestures, their tentative smiles from moments ago, and a fierce protectiveness, unlike any he'd ever felt, surged through him. It was a protectiveness born not of brute force, but of a profound, heart-wrenching love. "I need to go," Frank said, his voice clipped, to Maria, but his eyes were on his sons. "Something's come up." Maria nodded, her gaze steady. "Be careful, Frank." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight of concern that resonated deep within him. He strode out, grabbing his leather jacket, the scent of pine and cinnamon fading behind him, replaced by the cold, biting air of the Christmas night. The roar of his Harley-Davidson engine shattered the quiet suburban street, a familiar, almost comforting sound that usually cleared his head. Tonight, however, it only amplified the turmoil within him. The image of Leo and Max's expectant faces, the feel of their small hands on his arm, the soft warmth of Maria's knitted scarf against his skin, these were new sensations, new anchors in a life that had always been adrift. The clubhouse was a cacophony of raised voices and the clinking of bottles, a stark contrast to the peaceful warmth of his home. Grinder met him at the door, his face grim. "About time, Frank." "Rival club, the Iron Vipers, hit one of our smaller outposts. Stole a shipment, roughed up a couple of prospects. They're making a statement." Frank felt the familiar adrenaline begin to pump, the instinct to retaliate, to defend his territory, his brothers. This was his world, the world where he was powerful, respected, feared. The world where he knew exactly what to do. "Where are they?" he growled, his hand instinctively going to the knife sheath on his belt. Grinder grinned, a flash of predatory satisfaction. "That's the spirit. We got intel. They're holed up in an old warehouse district on the other side of town. We're rolling out in 15. Going to teach those snakes a lesson they won't forget." As Grinder turned to rally the others, Frank paused. He looked around the smoky, dimly lit room, at the hardened faces of his brothers, their eyes gleaming with the promise of retribution. He had been one of them for decades, lived and breathed this life of loyalty and violence. But tonight, something felt different. The roar of the engines, the promise of a fight, it all felt hollow, distant. He saw Grinder's bloodthirsty grin, and for the first time, he didn't share it. He thought of Leo's innocent giggle as he pressed the star-shaped cookie cutter, of Max's quiet hum as he listened to Bing Crosby, of Maria's gentle stories. He thought of the scarf, the crudely drawn picture, the profound, almost overwhelming connection he'd felt reading to his sons. This wasn't just about a stolen shipment or a statement. This was about a cycle, a relentless, unforgiving cycle of violence and retaliation that had defined his existence. And for the first time, Frank saw it for what it was, a cage. A cage that kept him from the quiet, fragile beauty that Maria had so painstakingly woven into his home. He saw his sons, perpetually waiting in the silent shadows of his absence, and his heart ached with a new, unbearable pain. He couldn't go back to being that man, not after Christmas, not after Maria. He walked over to Grinder, who was strapping on his vest. "Grinder," Frank said, his voice calm, but with an underlying steel that made the other man pause. "I'm not going." Grinder slowly turned, his scowl deepening. "What did you say, Frank? You kidding me? This is a declaration of war. We need you, patch holder." "I said I'm not going," Frank repeated, his gaze unwavering. "I'm done with it." A hush fell over the room. Brothers turned, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Frank Moretti, the formidable Hell's Angel, backing down? It was unthinkable. Done with what? Grinder sneered, stepping closer, his bulk intimidating. "Done with your brothers? Done with your patch? You gone soft, old man? That new maid of yours got to you?" His voice dripped with contempt, hitting a nerve. "Don't you dare talk about Maria," Frank growled, his fists clenching, the old rage threatening to surface. But he reined it in. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about choice. "I'm done with this life, Grinder. Done with the fighting, the endless bullshit. I got sons who need me. Really need me. And I'm going to be there for them." Grinder laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think you can just walk away, Frank? You think that's how it works? Once a Hell's Angel, always a Hell's Angel. You betray us, there's a price." Frank looked at him, then at the other faces, some angry, some confused, some even a little sad. He knew the cost. He had always known. But the cost of staying, of continuing this life, was far greater now. It was the cost of losing the fragile light that had just begun to illuminate his son's world. "Then I'll pay it," Frank said, his voice firm, resolute. He reached up, slowly, deliberately, and unzipped his leather vest. He pulled off the patch, the iconic winged skull, a symbol that had defined him for decades. He held it in his hand for a moment, feeling the weight of its history, the blood and sweat that had gone into earning it. Then, with a quiet strength that surprised even himself, he laid it on the worn wooden table, directly in front of Grinder. "Consider this my resignation." Grinder stared at the patch, then at Frank, his face a mask of disbelief. No one had ever done this. Not Frank. "You're making a huge mistake, brother," Grinder finally said, his voice low, menacing. "Maybe," Frank replied, "but for the first time in a long time, I think I'm making the right one." He turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving behind the stunned silence, the angry glares, and the life he had known for so long. The cold Christmas air hit him, but he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The roar of his Harley, as he kicked it to life, was no longer a symbol of defiance, but of departure. He rode back through the quiet streets, the chill wind whipping at his face, but he hardly felt it. His mind was clear, his purpose singular. As he pulled into his driveway, the house was dark, save for a soft glow from the living room window. He dismounted, and for the first time, he didn't feel the urgent pull to leave again, to seek solace in the familiar chaos of the club. He felt the pull towards home. He entered quietly, the scent of lingering pine and cinnamon a welcoming embrace. Maria was sitting by the unlit Christmas tree, a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately finding his. There was no judgment, only relief, and a profound, quiet understanding. "Frank," she whispered, a soft smile gracing her lips. He walked over, shedding his jacket, the weight of his old life symbolically falling away. He sat beside her, the soft fabric ornaments of the tree brushing against his arm. I'm done, he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. With the club. With all of it. Maria reached out, her hand gently covering his. I know, she said, her voice a soothing balm. I heard your bike. And then the quiet. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a housekeeper, but a woman of extraordinary strength, compassion, and wisdom. Maria, he began, I don't know how to thank you. You changed everything. For them. For me. She squeezed his hand. You did the changing, Frank. I just showed you where the light was. She paused, then continued, her voice softer. The boys are asleep. Leo kept asking if you were coming back to read to them. He said he liked your voice. A fresh wave of emotion washed over him, a potent mix of regret and burgeoning hope. I will, he promised, the words thick with conviction. Every night. The next morning, Frank woke to the sound of Leo and Max's excited voices, a sound that, for the first time, didn't fill him with a sense of inadequacy, but with a profound sense of purpose. He walked into the kitchen, where Maria was already preparing breakfast, the aroma of coffee and warm toast filling the air. The house felt different, lighter, infused with a new kind of energy. He sat with his sons, listening to them recount their dreams, describing the textures and sounds of their imaginary worlds. He found himself engaging, asking questions, truly listening, his rough hands now finding comfort in gentle touches, guiding their fingers to the warmth of their oatmeal bowls. He saw Maria watching him, a soft, approving smile on her face. Frank knew it wouldn't be easy. The Hell's Angels wouldn't simply forget him. There might be repercussions, challenges. But looking at his sons, seeing the genuine joy in their faces, feeling the quiet strength of Maria's presence, he knew he had made the right choice. His life, once defined by the roar of engines and the unspoken codes of brotherhood, was now being redefined by the gentle jingle of Christmas ornaments, the warmth of a hand-knitted scarf, and the innocent laughter of his blind sons. Maria had not just brought light into Leo and Max's sightless world, she had opened Frank's eyes, not to what he could see, but to what he could feel. She had shown him that true strength wasn't found in a leather jacket or a fearsome reputation, but in vulnerability, connection, and the unwavering love for his children. The shadows that had long clung to Frank Moretti's home had finally begun to recede, replaced by the enduring warmth of a Christmas miracle, a quiet revolution that had only just begun to blossom, painting a future brighter than he had ever dared to imagine. He would learn to be a father, truly a father, guided by the gentle hand of the woman who changed everything. His sons now had a father who was present, who saw them not with his eyes, but with his heart, and that was a vision far more profound than any sight could offer.